Israel began another major operation today. This time, hundreds of troops have entered cities in the West Bank. Israel says it is targeting Palestinian militants there. At least 9 people are reported to have been killed so far. Now, this is the biggest raid into the occupied West Bank territories in 2 decades. This raid is a significant escalation following months of low-level attacks into the occupied territory. Nearly 3 million Palestinians live under Israeli military rule here.
Hamas says this is an expansion of the war against Palestinians. Israel says the raid was spurred by Iran using this area as a clandestine smuggling route for weapons to Hamas. Israel's foreign minister has suggested that some residents of the invaded area would need to leave their homes. Now, here to break it down for us is Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, Trita Parsi. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So why don't you tell us what you know about this and if what we're hearing from Israel, it seems to be accurate?
Well, it certainly is accurate that they're going into the West Bank, and they have been for the last 10 months. They have killed more than 650 Palestinians in the West Bank, and we should remind the viewers that Hamas actually is not present in any strong way in the West Bank. That is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. But they've nevertheless gone in, killed more than 650 Palestinians, while at the same time taking more than 1,000 prisoners from there as well, which we hear very little about in the media, mindful of the fact that these are not, they're not detained and prosecuted, they're just put into prisons, and some of them are put into some of these detentions that we now have evidence for, where massive human rights violations and torture has been taking place. So this is further escalation. I have to say, I find it very unlikely that not any of this would be happening had it not been for the Biden administration just constantly giving the Netanyahu government the carte blanche. I mean, after several vetoes against resolutions calling for not just a ceasefire, but also the release of the hostages and this constant protection of whatever it is that the Israelis are doing, whether it's assassinations in Tehran, in Lebanon, bombing raids in Lebanon, including in Beirut. Whatever it does, the Biden administration is providing diplomatic and political cover for, while also providing military cover, because we have now moved more ships, I think around more than 20 naval ships to the Middle East, essentially to provide the Israelis with impunity as they are committing these crimes with our weapons.
You mentioned the Biden administration's role in facilitating this. Where do you expect the administration to come down on this escalation in the West Bank? Is there going to be any statement from Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever is actually in charge over there? They've been so supportive of what Israel is doing against Hamas in Gaza, and they can say that, well, we're supporting our ally that was attacked and is at war with a terrorist organization. But what's the rationale for what's going on in the West Bank? And will there ever come a point where this administration or the next one, which could be a continuation of the previous administration, is going to finally say enough is enough?
So I won't be holding my breath, and I don't think there's many others that would either. But I think at the same time, while the Netanyahu government most likely is taking advantage of the political season here, calculating probably quite correctly that in the midst of a political election season, the Harris campaign is not going to be particularly inclined to get tough with Israel, and Biden doesn't have the inclination to ever be tough with Israel regardless. And take advantage of that and further escalate and destabilize the Middle East during this period. But I think we also have to recognize that Harris needs to recognize that it lies not only in the U.S.'s interest to make sure that we don't see this escalation. Every month, there is some new escalation by the Israelis, and every time they do so, they bring the United States closer into war in the region. But there's also in her own personal political interest to do something about this, because if the Israelis continue to escalate in this manner and Harris keeps on just repeating Biden talking points, that will cost her tremendously with those voters who she will need in Michigan, in Georgia, and other states in order to be able to win the elections.
I think many people see this kind of a invasion of the West Bank as maybe a Gaza 2.0. But is there any hope left for the Palestinians? Is this somehow different from the ground invasion in Gaza?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to note also that the Israeli foreign minister himself said that this is going to lead to Gaza-like evacuations. I mean, we've seen what that means in Gaza. That means that millions of people, 90% of the entire population of Gaza, are currently displaced. Many of them having to evacuate from one corner of Gaza to the other more than 10, 15 times. And every time they do so, several of their family members die of hunger or thirst, while at the same time, many of them, of course, are being killed by missiles, hitting tents where refugees are sleeping. If that is what they are calling for to happen in the West Bank, where Hamas is not present, then it's further pushing the envelope of testing. Is there any red line? Is there any point in which the United States would say, enough is enough? You are doing all of this with our taxpayers' money, with our weapons, and you are destroying America's standing on the global stage, something that we absolutely will need, given the fact that in this century, there will be increased tensions with China. It's not inevitable, but we will go towards a situation in which there will be a lot of geopolitical flux, and not having standing, not having credibility, not having any of those things is a huge detriment to the United States. And that is what Israel is causing the US right now, let alone the mass murder of the Palestinians.
What is the response from, for instance, Iran to, what Israel doing this type of thing? We saw reporting, I think yesterday, that Iran was willing to have talks about its nuclear program again with the U.S. But does this, continued escalation of tensions in the Middle East dash any hopes for real progress on peace between the U.S., which ultimately should be the goal of the U.S. government to make sure our citizens are safe and protected, our peace with Iran and other states we've not always gotten along with in the region?
It's a great point, because it does exactly that. We are now seeing clear signals from Iran, from the Pezeshkian government, as well as from the supreme leader, opening the pathway for diplomacy with the United States. A critical thing that has happened on that front is that the Iranians are now also recognizing that the JCPOA, as it was negotiated back in 2013 to 2015, has now been overtaken by events. It does not mean that a nuclear deal should not be pursued, but it cannot be the identical one that was pursued 2013 to 2015. So this has been the US position, both on the Trump and on the Biden, that they wanted to renegotiate it. In my view, at a time in which it wasn't necessary for it to be renegotiated. But because it's now essentially not been in effect for so long, going back to it is no longer possible. And now the Iranians are coming to that position as well. This should be welcomed by the United States, because it means that even though the two countries have a very different perspective of what the deal should look like, at least they're now recognizing that there is a need for a new deal. All of that is being jeopardized by the escalation of the Israelis that is leading the region towards some form of a regional war. That will make it very difficult, not only to be able to pursue that diplomacy, but also to sustain this level of common interest in which both sides seem to want a new deal. If there is a regional war, there is a significant risk that the Iranians will conclude that it's not a deal that they need, it's a nuclear weapon that they need. And this is a crucial, devastating outcome of what the Netanyahu government in Israel is doing, with the permission and active support of the Biden administration.
Now, how does this affect the ceasefire negotiation? I mean, it seems a bit ridiculous to even say there's still a negotiation on the table, because it seems that Israel and the United States are only willing to agree with some kind of ceasefire deal that allows them to remain militarily in the West Bank at this point and Gaza. So is there a path forward for peace at all?
Israel is looking for a ceasefire without a ceasefire. The Biden administration is looking for a ceasefire that the Israelis accept, which essentially is no ceasefire. So at this point, the negotiations are increasingly starting to look like a farce. They're looking as a diplomatic maneuver to allow the Israelis more time to do what they're doing, rather than actually pursuing these talks in a way in order to get to a point in which this violence actually stops. So again, this is another area in which the US has just completely lost control because of the manner in which the Biden administration has handled this. I mean, how many times should Blinken go out there and say, we have a deal, the Israelis have accepted it, only to hear Netanyahu within a half hour give a press conference in which he says, no, not at all, I have not accepted this deal. this is really ridiculous because it's making not only Blinken look like Israel's lawyer, but also Israel's incompetent lawyer that doesn't actually know what Israel's position is or is lying about it.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much. Your analysis on this issue always sheds light on things that I think the American people don't usually get to see. So we appreciate it. More Rising after this.
Thank you so much for having me.